This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam, and I'm your host, and we are here to help take your leadership to the next level. And I'm joined, as always, by Dr. Richard Blackaby.
Great to be with you. 2021, and it's still a delight working with you, Sam.
All right. So far, so good then. We're on the right track. Well, we hope your year's off to a good start, and we figured we'd do the first leadership profile of this year, going way back in time to a little-known revolutionary.
Yeah, we're not talking about Pancho Villa either.
No, we'd be talking about a man you may have heard of, Martin Luther.
Yeah, not King Jr., but even earlier than him.
Something about theses and a wall, a door, and nailing those up, and all kinds of fun stuff. So why don't we just dive right in? Maybe to start with, where did he come from? Who was he in the early days? And how did he become such a figure in Christendom and obviously the world, even beyond Christianity?
Yeah, and as I always do, I usually base biography on a particular biography I read, and the one that I would highlight for our readers today is Martin Luther, the man who rediscovered God and changed the world, by Eric Metaxas. And I've read a couple of Metaxas books. Of course, he's written one on Wilberforce and written one on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and for the most part, I like what Metaxas tries to do, which is to try to make these historic figures interesting and reachable. I think I've shared with you before. I think now and then I think he's a little loose with some of his historic facts. I think he does some good historic work and digs up a lot of stuff, but he might be if he were in a history PhD seminar, he might have gotten his wrist slapped a couple times by maybe speculating a little too much, but that's part of what makes it interesting. And so if people are asking me, there's a book that is kind of considered a classic called Here I Stand by Roland Bainton, which I have that as well. But it's a little denser, a little thicker and scholarly, and I've known some people who tried to wade through that because they were interested in Luther, and that's not for the faint of heart, I think, to read that. But
so Metaxas makes it a bit more approachable.
Yeah. Now his book is, it's not a wimpy-sized book, but it's not like 1,000-page biography like I would expect.
It's no Churchill biography.
Yeah.
But,
you got to put things in perspective. But there's over 400 pages here, and so you're going to get a good presentation anyway. But
good. And we'll leave, as always, we'll put links to that in our show notes as well.
Yeah. But of course, some of the problems with people like Luther is that they kind of become legendary, and we know that they were a big deal and they accomplished a lot, and literally a lot of legend builds up around them, and after a while, it's kind of like George Washington and cutting down the cherry tree. That's fictional, but you're taught that in school, to the point where legend becomes reality, and so sometimes you have to, and it takes nothing away from great people by pulling away the legend, the stuff that's not true. The fact that there is a legend around them in the first place means that they were a big deal, that people thought a lot about them and wrote a lot about them, and so Luther is one of those people that you take nothing away from him by just taking a hard look at who he was, what he was trying to do, and like every person in history, you have to take them in their context. If you pull a guy out of the 1500s today, there's things about Martin Luther that are going to be offensive to you. For instance, he had some statements he made that were pretty anti-Semitic, and we'd look at that and say, well, Martin, how could you be such a Bible scholar and leader of the Reformation and yet have some kind of views like that? But you have to understand where he came from, what he's battling against, and to realize some of these guys, they broke ground that had never been broken before, so that Now you and I can look at things and just take it for granted.
Yeah.
And just say, well, everybody knows that. But you have to remember is back in the 1500s, everybody didn't know that.
Well, and I'd say it's not to excuse anybody, looking back with our 21st century eyes and saying, well, obviously they got that wrong, but it's to say that these are complicated people that aren't just one track.
Yeah, and if you find a person in the Middle Ages, there's a lot of superstition and bad science and things like that people have to overcome, and they just haven't learned that yet. Science hasn't discovered that yet. Books haven't been written about those subjects yet. So they in some areas they're going to break new ground and they're going to have insights, but some of the superstition maybe that they believe in, it may take another century or two before someone rids us of that. And so you can't blame someone. We have 500 more years of science. Right. And writing and theologians and so on contributing to our thinking that they didn't have. And so 500 years of great thinkers and writers gives us a bit of an advantage over them. And so it doesn't take anything away from them. In fact, in many ways, they're far more enlightened than their peers. So anyway, all that just to say, when you go back, you just have to kind of, to understand how huge it was, what they did, you have to understand where they came from, what was their context. And Luther, like a lot of people, there's so much written about him, but he was the oldest son of his parents, and his father was quite ambitious, had goals for his son, basically wanted him to be an attorney, was trying to set his son up to make lots of money and be very successful, and sent him to law school. Martin dropped out, not too far in. Part of what Luther said was law was all about speculation and uncertainty, and he was looking for certainty. He was looking for things that were true, that he could put his foot down and say, I know this to be true. And so he ultimately ends up going into theology, which at that time was really scandalous to his dad. It was disappointing. His dad had spent a lot of money getting him into law school and so on. And so to have his son just say, Dad, that's just not for me. Luther's not the first or the last son that will deeply disappoint his father by not following through with his dad's dreams for his life. Yeah. In Luther's case, he ultimately demonstrates that he didn't become a lawyer, but he did change history and he revolutionized the future. So started a Protestant Reformation, among other things. But that was Luther, and so he you can just tell at an early age that he's a sensitive soul. He's sensitive about his own sin. He's really quite troubled by the fact that one day he'll stand before a holy God, and he doesn't know that he'll be in a position to stand before that God. That he knows that he's a sinner, and he's just racked with guilt over that. But he has a couple of life-changing moments in his life that changed everything for him. One of those is July 2nd, 1505, probably about 12 years or so before he nails his 95 Theses to the wall. And he's returning from university on horseback, and a terrible lightning storm develops, and a lightning bolt strikes quite close to Luther. It's so loud. Of course, you have to remember, too, this is before loudspeakers, it's before airplane engines, it's before cars honking. They're just not used to that kind of noise, those kind of decibels. And so for a loud thunderstorm and lightning to crash seemingly right on top of you, scares him to death. And he actually cries out, "Help Saint Anna," which is, because he's a good Catholic, and he has learned about the various saints, and so interestingly, he doesn't pray to God. He prays to a saint who he believes can help him, and he says, "I will become a monk." And he basically is so scared that famously he says, just basically save my life and I'll become a monk. I'll enter a monastery. Well, his life is saved. He doesn't die. Probably wasn't in that much danger, but
he didn't know that.
But now he's made a promise, and he felt it was obligatory. He felt like he couldn't back out and say, well, St. Anna, I was a little premature there. And so he goes to the St. Augustine monastery, takes his vows ultimately becomes an Augustinian monk and a priest, and begins his pilgrimage to trying to find peace with God. And famously with Luther, there was a famous period where he's trying to get every sin he could imagine confessed, and he's just trying to be made clean before God. He feels unclean. He feels dirty. He feels like a sinner, and so through confession, he feels like if I can just confess everything, just once and for all, get every solitary sin dealt with, so I can feel clean. Finally, I can not worry that holy God gazes upon my life, and so he goes to confess to someone there, and a priest there in his monastery, and he's been going on and on and on. Of course, there's only so many sins you can commit in a monastery. so I mean, he's kind of stretching it, and he finally, and the poor priest who's taking confession is bored to tears listening to these petty little sins that are just causing such anguish to Martin. And finally, Martin's done, it appears, and the guy, much to the relief of the person he's confessing to, and he's just kind of wrapping it up and about to bring it to an end. And then Martin stops and says, wait, Father, I thought of something else. And he basically says something to the effect of that the night before they were having dinner, and they're, of course, very meager meal portions, and they put out the little bits of potato onto Martin's plate, and Martin, he confessed that he looked over at his brother so-and-so's dish and realized that he had a smidgen more potatoes than Martin did. And in that moment, Martin had unkind thoughts toward his brother. And he just wanted to confess that and get that right with God. And at that point, I mean, this may be kind of legendary as well, but I think at that point, the confessor just said something to him like, Martin, like, for goodness sakes, like, go out and like kill somebody or do something worthwhile of confession. But being jealous because your monk brother has like half a spoonful more potato than you do, like, come on, like. But that's where he was, and to an extreme, certainly. But he was trying to find peace with God, and in part, what I think Luther was realizing was that it doesn't take much when you stand before a perfect, holy God. Any little sin disqualifies you. One little sin is enough to separate you for an eternity from holy God, and Luther knew this, and Luther knew that there was he had not found a way to feel peace with God. So that's Luther, and but there's another issue going on, and we could probably don't have time certainly to get into all of it, but anytime you see the church getting basically wedded to the state, I'll just tell you, historically, the church has never done well when it is allied closely with the state, with the government. Of course, churches are always seduced by that. Oh, if the king were to be a member of our church, if he were to support our church, or if this famous politician or this senator would join our church, we could all say that, or the governor of our state goes to our church. What a coup that would be for us. And the problem is that the church is just far too easily seduced at times by the powers of government and the state. And so over the years, back in this time period, the Catholic Church had become very tied in with the government and the state. And basically the church was the wealthiest organization on the planet. They had a lot of wealth, a lot of influence, and a lot of power. and they used it. And we can, even if we assume that it was with the best of motives, still, once you start using force to convince people to do what you think they should do, you're in trouble. And so the church, and of course, back in the Middle Ages, there weren't a lot of jobs really available. You weren't going to go into the IT industry. You weren't going to probably be a startup specialist with a bunch of of financing and launching a new industry or anything. And so
there weren't venture capitalists.
Yeah, they were hard to find back at that time. And so, but the church was this vast organization, and it paid well, especially if you went higher up and became a bishop or something, or archbishop. And so if you're ambitious, you've got one life to live, and you'd like to make a good living, the church attracted a lot of ambitious souls. Whether they were necessarily very spiritual people or not was another story.
Yeah.
And so at a certain point, famously, the Pope Leo X is trying to build St. Peter's Basilica, the largest church in Christendom, and it's going to cost a lot of money. And so they're trying to raise money. And at that time, of course, there's a lot of poor people, peasants that don't have a lot, farmers eking out existence.
But even peasants who don't have a lot want to go to heaven.
They do, and they'll pay for the right to go there. And so famously, in that period of time, the church was selling what they called indulgences, and basically the Pope would write letters of forgiveness, and if you paid a certain amount of money, you could get an indulgence for yourself, or even for loved ones who died before, maybe for your grandmother. Or, of course, in that time they believed in purgatory, which meant you may ultimately be saved, you may ultimately go to heaven, but you have committed sins that didn't ever get forgiven properly, and so you may have to spend a couple thousand years, not necessarily in hell, but in a place there was some similarities to it, where you suffer for a while, and then finally you pay your debts and you go to heaven. And so they're going around selling this, and they're making a lot of money in part to build this huge church.
Richard and Daniel Blackaby will be at the Billy Graham Training Center at the Cove on May 17th through 19th, 2021. The title of this event is On the Move, How God Increases Your Spiritual Influence. It was originally scheduled to be held this year, but due to COVID-19 has been rescheduled. You can find out more and register at thecove.org. Links will also be in the show notes.
And so Luther looks at some of these kinds of practices and just says this is just bad theology.
Yeah, something's off.
And he says, and he of course rightly says, well, if the Pope, all he has to do is just write a letter of forgiveness, why doesn't he just do that anyway, without charging for it? Why doesn't he just do it for the love of humanity and help out? And who says that the Pope has that kind of power anyway to do that? Only Christ can forgive sins. And it's not by how much you pay, it's not by what you do, it's by his grace, it's by faith. And so he ultimately writes the 95 Thesis, where he and what we don't understand is, and if you've seen movies about this, of course it's dramatized quite a bit, but when he wrote his original 95 Theses, they were in Latin, and that was, and the average German peasant didn't read Latin. It was not really written for the common person.
Yeah.
Luther really just wanted to have a scholarly debate. By that time, he's the head of the theology department at his university in Wittenberg, and he just really wants the scholars to discuss this. And interestingly, he invites people to come and discuss these 95 statements he makes, and according to Metaxas, nobody actually shows up for the debate. I mean, it's an invitation. I'm going to welcome a discussion, a debate on these topics. Nobody actually shows up for the actual debate with Luther. But word does get out about these, and before long, some printers at the time, you have to realize too, the printing press has been out for just a little while,
Yeah.
And there's no copyright law at that time, and so you see anything that you want to reprint, and if you think you can make some money, you just reprint it. And Luther wrote a number of books. He never had very much money. He never made any money from his writing. Other people made lots of money from selling prints of his writing, but Luther did not. And so it gets out there, and a firestorm erupts. And what people don't realize now is that Luther was actually fairly conservative. He wasn't trying to leave the church. He didn't want to. His plan was not, I'm going to start a Lutheran church.
Right.
He just wanted to make his church better. He only thought of it as terms of there's just one church, and he believed radically that the Bible was the one source of theological truth. And he gets into trouble because the popes are saying that they are the ultimate discerner of truth, and that only they can really interpret the Bible. In fact, there's a real thought back then that all these illiterate peasants, you can't trust them to read the Bible. Like, they don't have training. They haven't spent years in school. And so we don't even want to put books in people's hands because they'll just misread it, misunderstand it, be led astray by some heresy. And so let's protect the people, and we just won't even let them read books in the first place. And then they won't be mistaken. And so it became very much just the elite who would do all the thinking for the masses.
Yeah.
And
how generous.
Yeah. And you kind of see that sometimes even to this day, don't you?
Yeah.
Where
people haven't changed that much.
It's like they're too stupid to manage their own affairs, to think for themselves. So we'll let people know what is the right way to think and what's the wrong way to think. Some things in human nature and power relationships just don't seem to ever change. But and so there were a number of things, like, for instance, even in the Mass, at that time, there's a Catholic Mass, or we'd call it now in modern Protestant circles the Lord's Supper or Communion. But back then, they wouldn't let the common people have the bread and the wine. You got the bread, and the priest kept the wine. But only the priest actually got both. And again, it was almost, there was this sense in which, can we trust because of course they saw communion as an actual sacrifice of Christ's body and blood. And
you don't want to defile it with all these peasants.
Yeah, that was kind of their thinking. And so in many ways, it was very demeaning, very hierarchical. The rabble can't be trusted with this kind of thing. So when Luther, and of course the Bible itself is written in Latin, so there were a lot of priests who didn't speak or read very good Latin, so there just really weren't a lot of people that knew the Bible. And so Luther is studying the Bible, and he keeps finding stuff in the Bible that the church isn't doing. And so he begins to ask questions to say, well, where in the Bible is this? Or how do you judge? Or the Bible says this, how you're doing the opposite. And so he gets into a great conflict with the church, and basically the church just says they don't and he keeps saying, Luther, if you kind of read through the various debates and meetings he has, his heart is not really to try to stir things up. He's a theologian. He's an academic. He really just wants to sit in a room and let's just discuss this. Let's talk about what the Bible says. But every time he gets in a meeting with church officials, typically what they'll say is this. They'll say, well, Luther's already with the Bible to say, well, let's talk about what Paul said here in Romans chapter 3. But when he gets into a meeting, they'll bring out a stack of Luther's books and say, Luther, are these your books? And Luther knows if he says yes, which he kind of has to, his name's on it, then their next statement will be, well, the church has already declared that these have heresy in them. So if they're your books, then you're a heretic. And so that's no further discussion. And he keeps saying, well, show me. And he'd say, well, just show me where I'm in error. Well, that's beyond what this meeting's about. We've already decided that you're in error. So all you need to do is recant and just say, you made a mistake and that you're wrong and the church is right. And he would say, well, show me in my books where I'm wrong. Give me a sentence here that is wrong. And most of the time they'll say, well, no, that's not the prerogative here. It's already been decided that you're a heretic. You just have to, renounce and repent. And so, of course, that drives Luther crazy. But what helps him is that, and again, sometimes we think that, Luther is on to biblical truth, and biblical truth sets people free, and God will bless truth that comes from His Word, which is what happens with Luther. But there's always more to it than that in history, and so part of what happens with Luther is that he taps into the masses, and especially, remember, he's in Germany, and these Italian cardinals and archbishops, they're just bringing wagon loads of money out of Germany down to Rome to pay for the St. Peter's, and they're basically ripping off these German peasants who are being made to feel guilty. They barely have any money, but if they don't give all the money they have, their poor grandmother is going to spend 10,000 years in purgatory just because they were cheap and wanted to hold on to their money. And so Luther sets these people free from this exploitation, this fear, this superstition. And Luther does a couple other things. He translates the Bible from Latin to German. And for the first time, Germans actually can read the Bible in their own language. And he changes the Mass from Latin to German. All of a sudden, people can actually, because there were a lot of people in that day who would go to church and not understand one word that was being said. Yeah. They didn't understand Latin, and so they'd gone to church all their life, so they kind of had an idea of what you said when you stood, when you knelt, but they really didn't understand what was being said, and so Luther appeals to the common person, and it becomes revolutionary. And so when the church declares that he's a heretic and just needs to be burned at the stake, to the church's disappointment, the Germans don't do that. They don't arrest him. Instead, they support him, and they say, well, we don't really like these religious politicians down in Italy making rules about how we live up here in Germany, and taking all of our money and making us have to speak a language that none of us speaks here when we go to church. And so Luther, when you read his story, what you discover is, one thing is, as he goes to the Bible, he discovers how revolutionary the Bible is. And the Bible speaks to modern day. The Bible still will hold up modern society, and the Bible will also address how we do church. And we now think, well, yeah, but that was the olden days. Well, by the 1500s, the Christianity's been going around for 1500 years. The Bible's old then, and yet it's very, very relevant to Luther's day, and it's still relevant to our day as well. And you look at a guy like Luther, and he's got his flaws. He has his shortcomings, but really history kind of catches him by surprise. When you read his story, you realize he is not setting out trying to be a revolutionary. Right. In fact, he actually tries to kind of stem the tide at times to say to his followers, hey, let's not get too carried away here.
He's just trying to make the Catholic Church a better version.
Yeah, and the church really kind of misplays its hand. Of course, it doesn't know how it's going to turn out, but they, instead of just engaging him in an honest kind of discussion and debate about Scripture, they're too quick just to label him a heretic. And of course, we see that today. We don't understand other people. Just call them politically incorrect and the wrong side of history.
Call them names and shun them.
Yeah, and ghost them. But that's not how you resolve things. And there are some things, especially if God's the author, that they're going to be too big to just try to hide. And once truth starts to trickle down to the common masses, you can have some hope that the powers that be, the elites, were not able to keep a lid on it with Luther.
Yeah.
And throughout history, it's been very difficult for the elites just to sort of control the masses forever. You can do it for a time, you can bully them, but ultimately truth is very powerful as it gets into people's hearts. And so that's the story of Luther, the power of truth, the power of just a humble monk in an isolated Augustinian monastery. Can God change the world? Nobody would ever know where Wittenberg was if it wasn't because of Luther and what he did. It's and so I think what history tells us is, don't ever feel like you're insignificant. My church is just a small little church, or I just run a small business. If God in his word inspires you with truth, it's amazing where that truth can go and how it can affect people for centuries to come.
Well, a fascinating life and a fascinating read. Again, we'll leave links to the Eric Metaxas biography in our show notes. And as always, these are always lots of fun to look at these leaders throughout history. So until next time.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.